One of the most successful products I've developed over the years is this fuel injector pressure tester. I can still remember the day. It was about 12 years ago. We're sitting around the shop. We're thinking, hey, we got to come up with something better than what's on the market to test these old diesel fuel injectors. And we went through so many attempts at trying to make one of these. And we had to laugh, you know, and we put this thing all together and we thought maybe somebody might want to buy this. And I remember we put it up for sale and it was like nobody bought one for like a month. And then after 4 or 5 months, you know, we sold about 10. And I remember telling my mechanic, Jerson, I said, you know, I don't think people want these things. I think this was a total waste of time developing this pressure tester. You know, we thought it was real cool because you could mount it on the bench, you know, and you could do it in your garage or outside. And it was real easy for the home DIY mechanic to check and test and rebuild his diesel fuel injectors. We almost gave up, but then it started to sell a little bit better. And now I can't believe how many hundreds of these pressure testers we've sold. In fact, every day in the shop, we have to be working on these. Somewhere, somehow, they take about 20 different operations to build these, including drilling, tapping, grinding, welding, painting. And so every day, it's like, we better work on pressure testers here, we're going to get behind. So that's kind of how that whole story evolved. But the other thing was, as we went along, we found out a few years later that we could use this tester to clean and check these CIS injectors in the gas cars. And then a few years later, we found out that we could test these early, very early mechanical fuel injectors back from the 50s, late 50s and 60s. So it truly has become a universal fuel injector pressure tester cleaner for both diesel and gas engines. Let me show you the reasons why this became such an easy product to develop into a universal fuel injector tester. Let's take a closer look at these fuel injectors. This is a diesel fuel injector. This actually showed up in the early 1950s, okay? So we're talking about early 50s up into the late 90s, where Mercedes-Benz used Bosch mechanical diesel fuel injectors. So there's a lot of application here for a lot of diesels. And it's not just Mercedes. There's Toyota, Nissan, Peugeot. A lot of the older diesels use Bosch mechanical fuel injectors, and you can use this pressure tester to test those as well. And then enter the mechanical fuel injector for the gas engines. I have a 1959 220 SE that uses a mechanical fuel injector similar to this. It's longer and curved, but this one showed up in the early to mid 60s, this style here, and continued on up until the early 70s. And at that point, Mercedes went to electronic fuel injection. But this covers a lot of cars and a lot of years. That's the mechanical gas fuel injector. And then in the middle 1970s, Bosch introduced the CIS fuel injection system. And this fuel injector was used right up to about 1993 on various 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder, and V8 gas engines. So, what makes these all the same? You won't believe it, but it's the fitting. The attachment fitting, look at that. There's the diesel, there's the MFI, and there is the CIS injector. All those fittings on the top of the injectors are the same. Isn't that amazing? That just made it so easy for me to develop this pressure tester. Now I need to make a note here. If you have a late model gas engine, it has this style of injector, but it has a smaller thread. And in my kit, I provide an adapter so you can adapt this fitting to the later style CIS fuel injectors. So that spans a period. So if we start out in the early 1950s, all the way up to late 90s, and these are anywhere up to the early to mid 1990s, look at how many years of fuel injectors this injector tester can clean and test for you. My biggest concern for the home mechanic using this pressure tester has always been safety. You know, I recommend in all my videos and my manuals that you do not test, never test with gasoline. I like using diesel fuel to test. It's much less volatile. And if you're using a cleaning compound, you have to be really careful. Something like a paint thinner, then you want to do it outside and do it with a mask. You know, I strongly recommend using a high quality paint respirator. No, don't use any of these, cheap paper masks. They don't do nothing, but you need a very good, and with new cartridges when you do this. So I've always been concerned about fumes. And so as a case here in my shop, I used to rebuild hundreds of diesel fuel injectors for our customers. I no longer have time to do that. Oh, by the way, that's because I'm spending all my time making these things so that you can do it yourself. We just do not have time here to rebuild diesel fuel injectors for customers anymore. That's just the way it is. So along with the evolution of the pressure tester, I've had this safety issue kind of evolve too, beginning with, of course, recommending that you always wear a mask, or you do this right next to an exhaust fan that's exhausting the fumes out of the building, or you do it outside when it's windy so the fumes are blowing away. And when I got into these gasoline injectors and putting the kit together for that, that requires a lot more pumping, because you're trying to use a cleaner to clean through the injector, and you're doing that with a pumping action, and that's producing all kinds of fumes. So we even packaged bags up, little plastic Ziploc bags, which would allow you to put over the injector, and when you were cleaning, a lot of the fuel and fumes were going in here, but not all the fumes, because there's no way to completely seal that. Then when I got into the MFI, or mechanical fuel injector kit, I started providing a hose, 10 feet of hose, so they could hook this up to the end of the injector while they're cleaning and exhaust all those fumes out of the room through the window. Well, look at here behind me. This is my 560 SEC. I've just rolled it into the shop here, and I'm getting ready to pull the injectors and go through the cleaning process using this pressure tester. I'll clean them all thoroughly, and then I'll come back and check them to make sure the spray patterns are proper. Can you imagine how much fuel I'm going to have to pump to do that with 8 of this type of fuel injector? So just looking at the job, I said, okay, I got to look for a really nice day when it's windy. I got talking to Jurison, and we thought, hey, we need to come up with a better way to contain the fumes so that we can do this in the shop but have the fumes go outside, but we still got to be able to see the spray pattern. So this is what we came up with one day. We got a little pop bottle, we got a fitting and stuck it in here, and we put this hose out the window. And it worked really well, but the problem was, notice we did this with the diesel injectors, it fit kind of good. You could kind of screw it in a little bit, but what we found is if you're doing quite a bit of pumping, quite a bit of testing and retesting, that even the slightest cracks in this can allow fumes to come into the air, and then of course you're breathing them, so it's back to putting on the respirator. So we set out to say, do you think we could do this, actually get it sealed tight enough that we could actually do this process without having to wear a heavy-duty respirator? We still use exhaust fans, even if we have it sealed up. But there it is. That's the prototype. Developed about 4 weeks ago. And I said to him, I think we're onto something here. Let's work on this. Let's try to get one that will work on all 3 injectors, because all 3 injectors are a little bit different size. These are close, but of course the diesel injector is much larger. So after testing a bunch more options, this is what we've come up with. Here it is. The fuel injector exhaust vent, whatever you want to call it. I haven't decided what I'm going to name it yet. But what I've done is I've got the kit, so it has 2 different caps. A cap that will seal, the diesel injector, and then I've got another cap that you can really get these. You actually have to use a little bit of dielectric silicone grease to grease up that grommet. So those injectors go in real tight into the cap, and then you hook them up and you go ahead and exhaust. In this case, I'll just exhaust it out the roll-up door. Make sure you don't squeeze the plastic tubing down too much. But I've got 10 feet of hose that I supply with this kit, and that will allow you to set up your pressure tester on the bench, maybe in your garage, and you can open the window and exhaust all the fumes out to this hose. Now, we just did a set of diesel fuel injectors for a friend of mine. I just told you how, sorry, I just told you we don't do it. Well, this is a really good friend of mine. This is actually the fellow that got me involved in Mercedes-Benz. So I think he deserved a set of rebuilt fuel injectors. Sure enough, we went through the process of redoing 5 diesel fuel injectors, and we were just marveling at the fact there was no smell of diesel fuel in that room. No smell. Now, I got to warn you again, you do not want to do this job, either diesel or gas injectors, whether it be cleaning or whether it be testing for flow or whether it be rebuilding, like in the case of the diesel fuel, without some sort of fume protection method, okay? Don't breathe that diesel fuel. It just gets in the air and it's just really obnoxious. So there it is, my newest kit, developed this past week. I'm pretty proud of this. It works really well. Let me show you up close how you're able to hook this up and still see the spray pattern clearly through this clear bottle while it's exhausting all the fumes out the door. Let me show you how this vent bottle works with each of these 3 different types of fuel injectors. When you get the kit, all you have to do is plug the hose into the fitting here. I should warn you, after repeated uses, when using this bottle, you do need to keep it clean. Don't leave fuel in it, don't leave cleaner in it. Same with the hose. The hose may start to loosen up. If I were to get the really expensive fuel-resistant hose, it would make this kit too expensive. So if this starts to loosen up on you a little bit, just use a zip tie. That'll hold it on. You need to make sure that's tight because you're going to be developing a little pressure in here in the bottle because it is sealed. So you have to kind of be careful. Once again, if you're making your own bottle, be very careful that the bottle could pop off if you don't have a real tight fit. So if you just want to put the diesel injector in the bottle like that, make your own, and it's kind of loose like that, don't be surprised while you're pumping pressure that this flies off the injector. Just a warning, okay? So what I've done here is I've developed 2 caps. This is the cap for the diesel fuel injectors, and this is the cap for the gasoline fuel injectors. So we'll start out with the cap for the diesel fuel injector. And I'm going to go ahead and hook up this diesel fuel injector now. Okay, now let's stick the bottle on there. You may have to bend this a little bit to get the bottle on. Okay, and it goes on really tight. See that? You want to make sure you get these fittings very tight before you actually start building pressure with the tester. Now I'll just pump this up to show you its spray. I'm not going to critique the spray pattern, but you can see how it's, look at that fine mist, how it's squirting it into that bottle. Could you imagine having that squirt into an open shop and all that fine mist? This is actually a pretty good fuel injector. Look at that pop and look at that pattern. So there's the diesel injector. And when you get ready to take this fitting off the injector, make sure you bleed the pressure back in the tester. You know, I'm holding right now at about 1600 psi, so I'm going to bring that back down to 0 psi. And then we'll remove this diesel injector. Now I'll put the other cap on. I'm not going to change the gauge here for the purposes of this demonstration, but just assume that I have the CIS gauge on and I'm going to test these. So I'm going to tighten this one down. Notice I'm wearing heavy-duty nitrile gloves. That's something else you want to do. Do not do this operation without some type of protective gloves. Remember, this fuel absorbs through your skin. All right, now let's see how this one sprays. We'll tighten that down and then let's start pumping. Look at that. That injector's not very good. But you can see how nice it is to be able to get an injector in here in this bottle and start spraying the test fuel, which of course is diesel. And look at that. Look at how badly that one's spraying. Can you imagine what would happen to your fuel economy? That, of course, isn't holding any pressure. I'm going to take this fuel injector off. Have to be careful I don't spill that. And now I'm going to remove this one. And then we'll put the mechanical fuel injector on. And let's see how this one does. Okay, let's slide that right down on the grommet. Okay. Now I'm pretty sure this injector is no good either. But notice how nice that is to be able to have that bottle stay in place, even when you're building pressure. Now you're not building very much pressure with these gasoline fuel injectors. But when you're doing a diesel fuel injector, remember you're getting up close to 2,000 psi. So you might want to even take and bend this down. You can loosen up the hard line and put it right down on the bench. So if you're pumping with the diesel fuel injector, you know, any pressure will keep this from flying off. Just remember that when you're working with diesel fuel injectors, you're going to have a little bit higher pressure, and that will force this bottle off. But just imagine how well it's forcing the fumes out this hose and outside your shop or your garage. Okay, let's take a look at this injector. See if it's any good. Whoops, we're leaking. See that right there? So I didn't get it tight enough. Hey, that's not bad. Hear that squeak? Look at that. Well, I'll be. That's a good injector. These are getting valuable, by the way. These MFI fuel injectors are going to be hard to find in the future. They may not even be available. I remember when I was cleaning and testing the fuel injectors on my 6.3, I discovered they're about $2,000 a piece. How's that for the cost of an injector? So there you have it. Look at all that fine mist. Imagine breathing that. So here you see how you can use this vent bottle to control the fumes. I would say that it's a good idea if you're working indoors to even put the mask on. Because when you're working with this, you're taking it on and off, and there's other fumes. So wear the respirator anyway. If you're outside in a nice breeze, which I prefer, then this particular arrangement works great. So no matter what you do though, I'm going to encourage you, and I'm going to admonish you, and I'm going to warn you, use some type of venting when you're cleaning and testing these fuel injectors. This is time-consuming to make, by the way, and a little bit challenging, primarily in the area of drilling through plastic and doing it in a way you don't crack the plastic or develop, you know, sharp edges that can crack in the future. So we actually had to make some special drills that we hooked up in the lathe to drill these caps and to drill through the side of these bottles, and then find the right grommet that the fitting and the fuel injectors fit really tight, so there's no chance of any type of fume leaking out of the bottle itself. Now I'm going to offer this on my website. I'll try to keep the price down because I really want people using this. Now, I know if you say, well, I don't want to buy that, and I'm going to encourage you to try to make your own. You can certainly make your own out of something like a pop bottle or a drink bottle. The challenge is going to be getting this fitting or hose tight into the bottle. If you cut a hole, carefully cut a round hole or drill through or develop your own drill, you could shove just the clear hose in there and get a tight fit. But if you're going to put the injector through the top, make sure you figure out some way to provide a tight seal, either getting the cap and cutting or drilling through the cap so that you can have a tight fit of the injector here, and you need a tight fit of the hose there, and you can use anywhere from 5 to 10 feet. I'm using 3/8 inch clear hose here to exhaust it out the window or out under the roll-up door, whichever is more convenient to where I'm testing. As a parting comment, I just want to encourage you, find a way to exhaust those fumes when you're doing any type of fuel injector testing, and don't breathe them.